Hello and welcome to session 16 of Talking Aspergers with Andrew. My name's Andrew Marsh and I'm going to be talking to you today about a particular aspect of Asperger's syndrome in the wider context of inclusivity. As I always state at the beginning of my calls, I'd like to record this call. So if you're okay with that, I can record it and put it on my YouTube channel, which can be available for public consumption. I'd appreciate that. So if we're okay with that, we'll go on. So the future of inclusion is what I call this. It's a very big topic. And I think one of the things that we should start with is saying, what does inclusion mean? And I think if we add to that diversity and equity, I came across two definitions of them today, which I'd just like to read to you. Diversity, everyone is invited to the party. Equity, everyone gets to contribute to the playlist. And inclusion, everyone has the opportunity to dance. Now, I like that. I think that's a very plain and straightforward definition of those three terms. Got a slightly different definition for you. Diversity, all the ways in which people differ. Equity, fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement. And inclusion, a variety of people have power, a voice, and decision-making authority. I like that as well because it sets out, particularly the inclusion one, decision-making authority. And I think it's so important that when we look at the business sense, that we're not just looking at a 1960s model of traditional white male businessmen in the board. There is a place for that, but there is a place for other people to be in the board, in the decision-making process at board level and throughout a company. I think one of the phrases I use, and I think it sets the context of my own experience of Asperger's into context, is if you always employ the same type of person doing the same type of job, then it follows you're going to have the same type of result. Now that might work fine if your process is making widgets. You've got a select amount of raw materials at one end, a process or two or three, and at the end you have a product. But most of our businesses today are so much more complicated and intense and varied that we're not just one raw material in, one product out. We're looking at a whole host of processes, and that's where being diverse, equity, and inclusive comes into its fore, because by having people who think differently, who look at a particular problem in a different way, then you might find that they have a different solution for the problem, or a solution that someone else hasn't come up with. And that can lead to innovation in business. And I think as we're now in the third decade of the 21st century, and I keep scratching my head sometimes finding out where we are when we're in the third decade of the 21st century. We have to look at the broader context of our society and what everyone in it can contribute. That's where my context of Asperger's come in, because if we look at people that we've said before in one of the previous sessions, people like Alan Turing, Leonardo da Vinci, Nikola Tesla, they were great innovators. They had because they thought of things in a different way. They thought of the what if question. And that's what we need in business, is people who think differently, people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different ethnicities, whether they're neurodiverse or neurotypical. We need everyone in the pot together so that we can come up with the best solution and the best ideas, and that will drive business forward. And it stands to reason that if you have people who are different ethnicities, different backgrounds, where they came from, even different social classes, all in the same meeting room discussing something, then you're going to have a much broader, more interesting discussion. You're going to have different points of view that will challenge the norms. And that way you will get something different from your business. You might find a solution to a long-standing problem that they may have had with your production. You may have come up with something new that is worth developing. It may not be something you can develop right there and then in that meeting setting, but it could be something that you could put to another team within the business to have a look at in a different way. And all of these things add up to us doing things better together when everyone gets the opportunity to speak and to be heard and be valued. And I think, as someone who has Asperger's, who's neurodivergent, I certainly, when I was working as a geologist, I wanted to be part of things, to question what was being said, to give, when questions were asked, to give my opinion, because it would then make me feel valued, rather than just being told to sit in the corner, don't say anything, do this one thing I've given you to do, and come and tell me when you're finished. That's demoralizing. You, even for someone doing what might be seen as the low end product, of the product or something at the bottom end of the system, they're still important, because if they get it wrong, everything else that follows goes wrong. So enabling everyone to have a responsibility to take ownership of what they're doing and then be valued in it, I think is so important. And I think as to go to the topic of this talk was the future of inclusivity, I think we need to get at it better. We need to be quicker at being more inclusive. There is the Equality Act of 2010, which sets out a whole host of principles as to what is lawful and what is not lawful. And I was reading it earlier today to prepare for today. And a very simple example of being something that is against the law. If you had a breastfeeding mother sitting on a bus, the bus driver cannot tell her not to do that. It's against the law for the bus driver to say, you can't do that on my bus. It's also against the law for that bus driver to say, you're not doing that on my bus, get off my bus. That's also illegal as well. So that's a very simple example of where a very ordinary, very normal, perfectly normal thing being done by a mother with their baby, she now has rights to protect her from being able to do that in places where she is out and about. She might be in a cafe with friends. Again, same situation there. She is allowed to do that. The law protects her and gives her the right to feed her baby in cafes, bars, restaurants, public places like libraries and so on. And I think if you were to ask people in the street whether they thought it was a good idea or not, and then say, actually, is this law or is this not? I think we'd get a very interesting response from people as to whether they thought it was a good idea or whether it was lawful. And I think the two might be quite different answers. So I think we need to have an education. It's great having laws, but we need to educate the people and businesses about what those laws are, what they say, and what people's rights are. And I think we need to have more information coming from national government, central government, regional government, telling us what the laws are and making us aware of them. And I found some government fact sheets and reports online just in this last week that clearly set out what can and can't be done and what is and what isn't lawful. So I think the starting point is to let people know, let businesses know what is lawful. And then make sure that everyone knows that, so that we don't have the situation of someone in a cafe saying, I'm offended because there's a woman breastfeeding her baby in the cafe. Well, sorry, sir, but if you're offended, then look the other way, turn your chair around so that you're not looking, or leave the cafe. The woman has the right to breastfeed her baby. So we need to, because there have been cases, I've seen cases in the last year or two where a gentleman complained to a manager in a cafe that there was a woman breastfeeding her baby in the cafe. I don't know whether the cafe owner knew the law or not, but there was a contretemps, there was a conflict happened that made the papers because of that situation. Now that needn't have arisen if the gentleman knew that if he was going into a cafe, that there's the potential for breastfeeding mothers to be there with their babies. So education is important. Businesses need to know what they need to do. And there are other things businesses need to do. Let me just have a quick. And that is when looking at, because if we're going to have diversity and inclusion, then that will mean that we will have people who have mental health issues. We'll have people who have mobility issues, people who are in wheelchairs, but perfectly capable and able to work and want to work. And there are things called reasonable adjustments. The law sets out that a business has to make reasonable adjustments to allow and cater for employees to be able to work in their businesses. And some of those reasonable adjustments are straightforward and some of them aren't. And then there are situations where the company pays for them, and there are situations where it's not quite so clear cut. But businesses need to know that they need to make reasonable adjustments. And one example that I've heard recently, which I thought was very good, was about mental health and people who have anxiety and depression. And it said, a business not catering for someone who has anxiety or depression in their business is tantamount to not providing a ramp for someone who has a wheelchair. It seems to be fairly obvious. Oh, there's someone in a wheelchair. We need to make sure that there's a wheelchair ramp so that they can get into the building. But it's also as equally important that someone who has mental health issues, or like myself with Asperger's syndrome, that there are reasonable adjustments that the business makes to enable that employee to work in an efficient way, in a way that suits them, so that they can contribute to the business. So these are things that, when we look at the broader context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we all need to consider. And it's actually quite interesting because the E part of that, the E, I thought E stood for equality, but E actually stands for equity, and there is a difference. There's an image that I saw on the net a while ago of 3 people standing behind the fence of a sporting event. And so the sporting event is going on. They haven't bought a ticket, but there's 3 people, and there's an adult, a teenager, and a small child. Now, if it was equality, you'd all give them a box the same height to stand on to see over the fence. Well, the little child, the toddler, won't be able to see over the fence. Equity is providing the right amount of boxes or the right height so that the little toddler can see over the fence just as well as the adult and the teenager. And I think that's a really interesting distinction. It's not providing everyone with the same support, it's providing the support that is appropriate and necessary for those people to work. And I think that's a really important distinction, and that one caught me out when I was doing some research for today's call. So I was going to ask you, Damien, what your thoughts were on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and whether you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I find it's very interesting. I would ask you one question though. For a normal business, when they've got getting a lot of things maybe thrown at them regarding the law, from how they operate. Obviously, education. You say education is a key for business to understand the law and what they can do. But I would just ask the question: why should a business bother to understand about autism and Asperger's, when maybe some directors may think, well, we just won't employ any? Well, maybe that's the first question to sort of educate people about, is why should they bother?
It's a good question. The short answer to that is, by not employing people who have Asperger's and autism, they are breaking the law. They are not.
Okay, right.
They are breaking the law. And let's just suppose. Let's suppose I was working as a geologist, and I was diagnosed when I was 35, and I then told my employer, I've just been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and then all of a sudden I find that I'm sacked. They can't do that now. They're not allowed to do that. They have to say,
one good thing.
Okay, how can we help you do your work better, to do your job? What can we need to do together so that we understand how each other works? What can we do that can help and support you in your work? And equally, in what we have now, is if there was 2 people looking for a job, one of them had Asperger's, one of them didn't, and they're both equally qualified. If they're equally qualified, they are entitled to choose either. But if one of them was more qualified than the other, say the person with Asperger's was more qualified, then they are obliged, they are duty bound to employ that person,
Okay.
rather than say, well, the other person nearly met the criteria, but because they don't have Asperger's, we'll pick that person. They can't do that. That's discriminating against the person who was more qualified, who happened to have Asperger's syndrome. So that's a distinction that is set out in the Equality Act of 2010.
So yes, I guess education and understanding of the positive aspects, that some businesses might not understand. I suppose that people would then, I suppose there's help, isn't there, for businesses to, from various organizations to understand where they can get help. Because
Yes.
I read about inclusion. Some people list under inclusion for people to have someone as a mentor to, to talk about any issues they may have in terms of communication, or one area I find in terms of understanding of email sometimes, or of direction, understanding a project, because sometimes there's a lot of communication which is informal, and sometimes that's the most important thing. But for someone with Asperger's, sometimes you can miss a lot of the things because they're concentrating on the bullet points and the instructions that are set out in a clear manner, but then someone is coming in with something else and changing it. So, but I'm not sure whether all the companies can have a mentor, whether there's, I guess there's some organizations people can talk to, or individuals can get advice on how to assimilate, better.
Yes. I mean, that there are organisations that specifically will go into businesses and say, this is the law. These are the things you need to be aware of. These are the things that you can do, and have a chat with them, and do a presentation to the board or senior managers, junior managers. So there are people that can do that, and the really important point is that the business realizes they have an obligation. I did a poll this week on Monday, and I said, I think the question was, are you ready for the DEI storm that is coming? And I had 10 response. 5 said yes, we welcome it. 4 said no, and 1 said we'll get by. So okay, 10 isn't a large poll, I grant you that, but of that number, half of the businesses says, yeah, we're up for it, we want to do the right thing. But the other, the 4 that said no concerned me. Did they say no because they don't think it's an issue that they need to address? Did they say no because they're just not going to bother? Or did they say no for another reason? But the one that's kind of irked me a little bit was the one that said, we'll get by. That kind of says to me, there isn't a clear commitment from the business as to what they're doing, and
that's what it says.
They'll appoint someone on the board to have some kind of directorial responsibility, but they won't do very much with it. And I kind of liken it back to health and safety in the 1960s, 1970s. If we take after 1974, because that's when the Health and Safety at Work Act came out, I believe it was 1974. Health and safety has been a very slowly evolving process in the construction industry, far too slow. And even when I started work, which was 1986, there were things going on sites that you think that they really shouldn't happen. And sometimes people were paying lip service to health and safety rather than getting down to the crux of actually, that's not safe, stop, don't do that. It was, oh, well, maybe we should do this, or maybe we should do that, or we'll need to speak to so-and-so about it. And I think there's a danger that with the diversity, equity, and inclusion situation that we now have, so the act has been out for 12 years now, that some companies will think of it a bit like how it was viewed health and safety in the 70s and 80s. And I think we need to get away from that. We need to accept the responsibility to do the right thing, and not just to do the right thing so that people we employ are more diverse, they've got more opportunity, their opinions are valued, but so that someone doesn't sue them, someone doesn't take them to court and say, you're discriminating against me. And I think it's going to come to a point where a reasonably large company that thinks it has a good reputation in a number of areas is going to get caught with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's going to be a court case that's going to go all the way, maybe even up to the Supreme Court that we now have. And I think it's going to take something like that to get a lot of people on board to understand that there is a law in place, you have obligations, you need to do better. And I think it's going to take something like that that's going to be splashed across the headlines of the newspapers and the media before some companies actually realize they've got things that they have to do. And I think that worries me. That worries me, because how many people in those companies have not had the opportunity, who are employed by them, who aren't getting the opportunity to speak up and say their piece and contribute. But how many other people who could be employed by those companies aren't getting the opportunity at all? And I think that's a worry. That's a worry.
Yeah, I think you're right. When as I say, some people say that we'll get through. Maybe they're thinking about how they will avoid getting into trouble with the law whilst not really being committed, but getting by, as in not being fined or not having an issue only.
Yeah.
As you say, with health and safety, that's playing lip service. Maybe other companies might be better at actually.
Yeah, and I think this is also an area where the public sector could lead. I think you'll find that I would imagine that the public sector is more aware and more in tune with the regulations, because they have the companies are more aware of it from a local government point of view and national government. So I think the public sector could be something that could lead this area. And I think some of the bigger businesses that I've encountered in what I've been doing for the last couple of years, they do have people on the boards who are their DEI specialists and responsibility. So I think I think the bigger companies are taking it on board, because it's just they understand the need, they understand the law, and they're going about it to do it. I think it's the medium-sized and the small companies that are going to get the problem's going to be, unless someone bigger gets caught out. What do you find in your work, Damien? How do you think it works with you? Have you had any training in DEI with your business?
No, I haven't done any training or any discussions about that sort of thing. So I'd have to look it up. I don't really not really aware of what's going on there. But I guess inclusion, I suppose one of the first things is the interview process, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
For companies, because the interview, in terms of inclusion, the interview process can be quite daunting, depending on how it's done. Although I've seen a lot of bigger companies and more public sector organizations, they will ask those sort of questions in the interview process, in the as you're applying for a job, they'll ask questions like that.
Yes.
So presumably that's because they're set up to accommodate, or to maybe take advantage, to assist.
I agree. I think the interview process is really important. They have to be very careful about how they word adverts now, because they can't. I was looking at this earlier today, and I got very confused. But there's certain wordings that you can't use. You can't refer to you. You can't say you want a young. I think you can't say you want a young person, or you want someone with certain levels of experience. I got very confused when I was looking at it earlier about what can and can't be said in a job advert, because clearly some jobs, for example, if I was to go back into geotechnical engineering, geology, I wouldn't be going back in at a junior level. I would be going, I'd be going back at a medium level, probably with responsibility for some teams and people. so they would need to know that I can do that, and how they ask those sorts of questions, they have to be very careful about it. Just as other questions when employing women, they can't ask the question, well, you're a you're a young woman, are you planning on having a family? They can't they can't ask those sorts of questions. People have to be allowed to have their lives, and businesses have to accept that some women are going to have children, and they need to accommodate that. And all of these sorts of things can become a minefield of regulations and laws to go through, and it does require someone at a senior level to take responsibility for it, just like you would have board responsibility for health and safety, and that gets disseminated through the business. Then you should have someone with board responsibility for DEI, and then not just be that person to pay lip service to it, but actually roll out the program so that the business culture reflects the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that's the point. I think that's the key aspect of this, is to have responsibility, but have that rolled out within the whole company, so that everyone knows what the business responsibility is. Everyone knows what the business stance is on DEI, because it may well be that if it's that someone might not want to work for a company that isn't actively making the employees aware that they are inclusive. They might think, well, actually, I'll go to another company because they're more open in their diversity, equity, and inclusion policy.
It would be more appealing, yes.
Yes, and
a company that outwardly advertises that they're.
That's right.
And in the initial interview process, when you fill in the initial forms, when they include that, then you feel a lot more positive about the potential for the relationship within that business.
Yes, and I think also the candidate has the opportunity to say, what is your statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion? How many employees in your company have responsibility for it? Is it just one on the board, or are there managers throughout the business that have responsibility for it? How does it sit with your company? And I think in potential candidates should be more open about the questions that they ask businesses. I think we should be at the stage where the employer actually understands that they are being interviewed as well. Yes. And I think most people tend to take the process of, I'd like to work for that company. There's an advert, I'll apply. Hopefully I'll get it. And they may or may not have done any research about that company, because they might know of them through the business that they're in. They might have heard that they've got a good reputation, which is a wonderful thing to be known for. But the candidate is also interviewing the business. And I think certainly it's very important, certainly, I would say at all levels actually, that the candidate understands that they are interviewing the business as well. Because I've had some interviews for companies and I've left the room and thought, there's no way I'm going to work for them. I'm just not going to do it. And it's a very short phone call or a 2-line letter when I get home. And I have done that. When I was doing it directly, I sometimes worked through agencies, and I would get put up for something. And I've had a interview. I remember one particular interview I had, and I could not get on with the 2 people that were interviewing me. I thought, I cannot work for these people. I don't feel as though there's a fit. It just didn't feel right. There was just an atmosphere about it that didn't feel right. And I phoned my agent, and they said, okay, thanks for letting me know. And that was it. And so, the candidates have the power to make those choices, and should be asking the interesting and difficult questions. Because if they sit there and they stutter and they and they are, and then that they haven't addressed the issue that you've asked them about. And that doesn't necessarily just need to be DEI. It could be health and safety. It could be, you might ask, what are the prospects for promotion within this company? And if they don't come out and say, well, we incentivize people to do the best and things like that. And if they say, well, we need to have people of a certain level of experience and length time served with the company. You know that you could be sitting there for a very long time before you get recognized and promoted, and all these things form part of the process of being a candidate as well as a company. And I think we should be more empowered to ask these questions.
Yeah, yeah. And that's also down to human resources. The type of person who is giving the initial interviews, I suppose normally is from human resources. They need to be open to a lot of questions, and you know, from maybe detailed questions about the job and the well, there's all sorts of questions about how the company operates that are important to someone, especially someone with Asperger's, how they would get on in that company.
It is important that normally when I've had interviews, it's been with people who are in the teams that I was working with, managers and directors. But yeah, I think human resources should be sitting in on that as well, because they might know more about the business strategy and business culture of a number of issues, and they should be part of the process, because the managers might know how to run their teams and deliver the technical or the project objectives, but the HR managers would need to be there to express the company culture and their position on certain things. And if that's found wanting, then that should be a red flag for someone at an interview. I agree that we need to consider everything, and the list of things that we need to be aware of grows and grows. But I think that's right. As I said earlier, we are in the third decade of the 21st century, and we really should do better in a number of areas than we are. And it's not just about, right, we're going to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion today. They have their day's worth of it, and then they forget about it. It's something that has to be rolled out throughout the company, just like health and safety need to be rolled out throughout the company, so that everyone understands, has a responsibility to be informed and to be asked their opinions and to be able to contribute to the discussion. I think everyone needs to contribute to the discussion, because the more people from different backgrounds and different ethnicities and cultures and genders and race and sexuality, then you're going to have a better answer than if you just stuck to a very narrow, rigid field of people of a certain type. And so yes, the more people that are involved in those discussions, then the better the discussion should be, and hopefully the better the outcome will be. Yeah, it's really important. It's really important. And having done some research in the last week looking at this, there's an awful lot of information. If you just did a Google search, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's an awful lot of information there. And some of the public sector, there was an interesting report by one of the unions that I saw, and that was quite good as well. So the public sector is aware of it, and they roll out packages to their members and their businesses. So it's quite interesting how it all fits together. But I think that if the one thing that I've said is, I think we need more education and we need more visibility about this particular topic, so that the right questions are asked by the right people, so that the right decisions and practices are put into place. But education is the one thing that I think we need to do more of.
Yeah, quite often this sort of thing is led by customers, because for instance, where in my work we have a whole list of standards, and in fact we've got a new standard which has been required by people like Tesco's, which is basically an audit on ethical management.
Yeah,
it doesn't include diversity as one, but maybe that sort of thing should be included, and then if the customers key customers are demanding this of their suppliers, then that will also provide the education. There's some education, and it will also highlight this to businesses.
Yeah.
You know, if people
Yeah.
like Tesco's and Sainsbury's or whatever are saying to their suppliers all over, even smaller suppliers, we need some sort of commitment from you on it, then people will follow.
Yes, I think that's right. I think they do. And when I was a geologist, we would have to, when we were bidding for work, we would have a whole host, as well as the technical aspects of the job. There was a whole other area of work, you know, capability statements and CVs and all of those things. But there were other things, like investors in people was one of the
Yeah,
things
that was an early one, but
in the 80s. And you're right, but that was something that some of our clients would say, you must be an investor in people before you can successfully tender for our projects. So that was a start. And I think you're right. Clients and customers have an equal role in dictating. Is that the right word? Dictating but in the discussion, so that people comply with with good practice in a number of areas. And one of the things that I've seen on some websites that I've been looking at is some companies, not all by any stretch, but a small number of companies will have an anti-slavery statement.
yes, we do
You
have an
do, you do,
anti-slavery. That's
right?
all part of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
ethical trading
yeah, yeah,
standard, which is run by Tesco's, I think, and Sainsbury's run this. And we have ethical, well, not audits, we have ethical sort of group discussions every 6 months, but more lines along the lines of gang labor and you know, sourcing your labor from the correct sources and not hiring children and things like that.
yeah, yeah.
So it tends to be very repetitive, but it doesn't. I think that maybe that sort of platform could take on this sort of thing as well. And
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Something that would be, I'd be interested to talk to the organization that I'm dealing with regarding ethical trading about this subject, because they might be think, well, this is an area they can sort of expand into as an education.
You hear from time to time certain high street shops, and I'm certainly not going to name any, but certain high street shops get caught with publicity statements that some of their workforce are children in certain parts of Asia, and
Oh, yes.
they can get caught. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but certainly the PR damage that can happen to a company just from something like that coming out, it can be quite significant. You know, share prices and image and all those sorts of things, as well as, is it true? You know, is there something behind the story that's true? And if it's so, what are they going to do about it? You know, because certain high street shops sell crop tops and things like that for 99p or £1.99. How do they do that and make a profit? You know, how do some of these stores make a profit when they're selling goods that are £1? Makes you want to ask the question sometimes, doesn't it? You know, do they buy in such bulk that they can get discounted rates, or is there something else going on that may or may not be ethical?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And quite a lot of pressure from either customers or consumers drives a lot of advancement in business as well, doesn't it? So
Yes.
as in with the clothes, you know, pressure from people who not to buy those particular store because of the child labor or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can drive a change.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic, and when it gets to a certain level, the big business, you know, big business is big money, and when
Exactly.
those two things come together, then sometimes, just sometimes, someone can get it wrong or not know. And that's the other thing. They not necessarily know that something being done further down the food chain of their customer base or their production base is actually doing something that's wrong, and they may not know. And so there's two parts to that, isn't there? There's not knowing, and then there's knowing and not doing anything about it. It's interesting topics. I can't believe we have gone through nearly 3/4 of an hour. Well, thank you for being on today, Damien. I'm sorry it was only just us, but it's an interesting topic. And if people out there are interested in knowing more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, then please feel free to drop me a line.
I'm going to talk to the people who normally organize our ethical trading rules about this as well, whether they're involved. So I'll let you know what they say. It'd be interesting to.
Thank you. I'd be interested to know. What
they're
they say.
dealing directly with customers like Tesco's and Sainsbury's who are driving the improved ethical standards, and I wonder whether they have any of this in their mind. So I'd be interested to.
Yeah,
and I'll let you know what they say. So
thank you. I'd be interested to know that. Yeah, I'd be interested to know that. Thank you. So I'm going to sign off the recording.